Hi, this is Gary Meese, back again with the case against. It's been quite a while. My apologies. I've had a lot going on, and I'm going to continue to have a lot going on, but I thought I could procrastinate on this much longer without totally losing the thread. I want to get back into the book, The Case Against the West Memphis Three Killers, which is a condensed, revised version of two books I wrote called Blood on Black and Where the Monsters Go. They're all available on Kindle. And rather than getting into some extraneous matters, I mean, there's been a lot going on in the legal field, in the criminal trial field since the last time I talked, but I'm just and in the parole system, etc., etc. I'm not going to get into any of that today. I'm just going to try to plow ahead with doing my allotted task here, self-assigned but allotted, and so we're going to talk some about the violent history of Jessie Misskelley Jr. Now, John Douglas, in one of his books, where he focused in on the West Memphis Three case, he claimed that none of the three had any history of violence, and the fact is there's been there have been a number of episodes recorded in which Jessie Misskelley Jr., Jason Baldwin, and Damian Eccles were involved in various forms of violence against others, and also visited upon themselves in some of the cases, two of the cases. I'm going to particularly talk today. I'm going to go ahead and just get into it. Even more than Damian Eccles, Jessie Misskelley Jr. was linked to violent episodes often aimed at children. John Earl Persecki Jr., 14, told police he had been attacked by Misskelley in January 1992. "We heard someone coming up," said Persecki's handwritten statement. "We tried to hide. Damian, Jason, Jessie, Buddy," and that would be Buddy Lucas, and 4 other boys were with them, and so Jessie shoved me against the side. Jessie took a knife out of his pocket and put a knife to my throat, and he said, "Would you like to be dead?" And so he shoved the knife harder, and so he put the knife up, and then Jessie hit me, and Buddy too. Damian and Jason and the other boys were still on the railroad tracks, and there he was yelling at me, and then they all left. I walked home. I was coughing up blood. A girl who had been at that scene, Tiffany Allen, 13, described another violent attack by Misskelley. He had been spreading a rumor around that he was having sexual intercourse with me to all these people, and I confronted him with it, and he kept saying all this stuff, so I slapped him. For a year, I didn't hear anything from him. Somebody said that he'd been looking for me, and one day I was walking through the park, and he was at the road, and he came up to me. He started running at me, and my boyfriend stepped in front of him. He hit Carl, and then he hit me, and we started to walk away, and he started coming after us again, so we ran. Until one of my friend's parents came and got us and took me to my house. She had a busted lip and made a legal complaint dated March 12, 1993, which is roughly 6 or 7 weeks before Jessie Misskelley Jr., Jason Baldwin, and Damian Eccles killed Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch on May 5th, 1993, in a secluded wooded area in West Memphis known as Robin Hood Hills. The boys were 8 years old. Tiffany's mother, Gayla Allen, went to the Misskelley home after the incident. Jessie Jr. ran out the front door while she was knocking on the back door. When she returned later, she said, "Okay, I knock on the door. Jessie Sr. was sitting in there, and he said that he just could not do anything with his son." A close friend of Misskelley's, Dennis Carter, told police that Jessie liked to fight, giving as examples an attack on Tiffany and another attack 4 or 5 months before, which consisted of a girl about 5 or 6 was throwing rocks, hit Misskelley. He chased the girl and then he threw a rock that hit her in the head, said Carter, and laughed when she started crying. The girl's mother called police, who talked to Misskelley. Misskelley, quote, told his father about it, but his dad didn't say anything to him about it. Carter described Misskelley's home life. States that he does not like his stepmother, Lee Rush, who was not really his stepmother. They weren't married at all. Miss Jessie Sr. and Lee Rush weren't married, just to clarify. States that she stays drunk all the time, and so does Jessie's dad. States that about 2 months ago he was spending the night with Jessie. When they came into the trailer around 6:30 p.m., Lee was passed out on the couch wearing nothing but her panties. Jessie went and told his dad, who didn't say anything. Dennis states that Jessie drank a lot and smoked pot when he could get it. States that he also saw Jessie sniffing gas about 20 times. Also saw Jessie take many thins, got high from those. End of statement. When he was about 11, Misskelley was accused of hitting a girl in the head with a rock or brick after he began beating her abusive boyfriend, and the girl jumped in to defend the boyfriend. Even earlier, Misskelley stabbed a 4th grade classmate in the mouth with a pencil. His problems dated to early childhood. Counseling and hospitalization were recommended, but there was never follow-through. The book Blood of Innocence described a June 1987 report from a social worker quoting Shelbia Misskelley, his stepmother. "He gets so mad he's capable of hurting someone." End of quote. "He had a habit of punching out windows, once requiring several stitches to his hand. When blood was found on a shirt after his arrest, Misskelley said it was his own, shed after punching out soda bottles." Shelby had told the social worker, "I don't think he can control his temper. He needs some help." Years later, a famed FBI profiler weighed in on the case. I get into it here. In Law and Disorder, John Douglas wrote, "Damien and Jason had no indicative violence in their past, and while Jessie was known for a hot temper, he channeled his aggressions into pursuits such as wrestling. In sum, I found nothing in the behavioral backgrounds of Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, or Jessie Misskelley to suggest that any were guilty of murder." Douglas, hired by the defense, made no mention of their violent histories. Douglas did not respond to questions I posed to him about the case. Admittedly, he gets a lot of emails, so forth, but I attempted to contact the man, never got anything back from him. My next chapter is going to be a description of what went on the day of the killings. I'm not going to get into that because it's a long chapter. I'm going to save that for another time. I was having some technical difficulties earlier tonight and really thought about scrapping even this attempt, but I decided that I would go ahead and do that, not using my preferred equipment, but some secondary fallback equipment. Sound quality is probably, I don't think it's ever that great, and it's probably not that good. since I've only been talking for about 10 minutes, I'm going to briefly give an update on the brouhaha over the West Memphis 3 so-called missing evidence. You know, the background on this is Patrick Binka, who's one of the defense attorneys, was inquiring about the state of the evidence because this actually dates back to Bob Ruff. Bob Ruff came up with this goofy idea that he could just go to Scott Ellington, who was the prosecuting attorney up until this last year, and get the evidence from the West Memphis 3 and have it retested using so-called new technology, MVAC technology, which is kind of a wet vacuum type process. It wasn't widely available when the West Memphis 3 were released on a guilty plea, an Alfred plea, but a guilty plea in 2011. But it was not new then. The MVAC technology had been around for several years. I think with a little bit of research, the defense attorneys, who were among the highest paid defense attorneys in the country and were, I'm sure they all had huge staffs, they could have checked it out to see what the very latest DNA technology was. They didn't use the MVAC technology then, though, as I say, it appears to have been available to them at the time. I don't know what the exact conditions would have been for using it. Maybe, it's possible, I guess, that maybe they contacted MVAC and MVAC said, no, sorry, we're not ready to have you use this. I just don't see that happening. The technology has been around for a while. So anyway, the West Memphis 3 passed up the opportunity to present their so-called new evidence to the courts. It was the hearing was set for December. They took the guilty plea in August, as a deadline was nearing for coming up with these results from the DNA testing. And according to some media accounts, they really didn't have anything, despite the impression that Eccles and some others continue to put out into the media that, and you'll see it even in news stories. There's a lot of news stories that seem to sort of suggest, if you read it, you don't know anything about the case, you would think that new evidence somehow forced them to take this, got their release, though it was a guilty plea, for times, and with release for time served, 10 years probation. But you would think that, based on those media reports, that the West Memphis 3 had some new DNA information. Well, if they did, it apparently wasn't information that was going to help them. Now, I'm not going to speculate what the information actually was, because I don't know. The West Memphis 3 do know, or should know. It was provided to their attorneys, and I'm certain they had access to that information. Lori Davis said she can't find the records. Perhaps she left it in that notorious storage shed in Arkansas that somebody bought up after they abandoned it. Who knows? That certainly wasn't on the list of things that were sold. So anyway, Bob Ruff came up with this idea that they could use this MVAC technology. And, he sort of chases around the West Memphis 3, and, it's not as if he has a real reasoned discussion with any of them about retesting the DNA. He basically bangs on Jessie Misskelley's door and says, "Is it okay if we do more DNA testing?" And Jessie, who's obviously doesn't want to talk to the guy, says, "Oh yeah, sure, go ahead." Eccles says it's okay. Jason says it's okay. But there's a notable lack of enthusiasm in their responses. I don't think they think they're going to find anything that's really going to help them. What they do find is whenever, they kept asking, they harassed Scott Ellington yet again. He's been harassed quite a bit back in 2011 by supporters to get the West Memphis 3 out, and he, as Terry Hobbs admitted in a recent interview, he was told by Ellington that the reason they wanted to release the West, work out this plea deal and release the West Memphis 3 was because they were tired of dealing with the case. Now, I've heard variations on that a number of times, and, honestly, that there were other considerations. There was money involved, potential liability for the state if they were exonerated. The amounts of potential awards are probably overstated, but certainly possible. Who knows what a jury's going to do? Maybe they would give them $60 million. Who knows? Probably not, though. If they actually saw the evidence, they probably won't give them anything. And let's see, where was I going with this? So Ellington was, basically, and there was some political considerations for Ellington and for Dustin McDaniel, and there were also just there was quite a bit of cronyism going on because Patrick Binka, who was this defense attorney, and Dustin McDaniel, who was the attorney general at the time, are apparently best buds. They're law partners now, and they knew each other from law school, so they worked out a cozy little deal between the two of them. Dustin McDaniel certainly had no great investment in. It wasn't going to hurt him in his political ambitions to have the West Memphis 3 released, and his political ambitions did come tumbling down. He was hoping to run for governor, but a sex scandal shot that all to hell. Scott Ellington was planning on running against a Republican, a fairly new Republican. I think he was in his first term then. A new Republican congressman from the Jonesboro, the district over there, the Jonesboro area, which also includes West Memphis. The congressional district does, and he was going to run as a Democratic candidate. Understand that the Democratic Party holds a great deal of power still in Arkansas, particularly in local elections and even in the larger elections, the national elections. But certainly for races like like congressmen and senators, it certainly plays a part. So the local races are almost all Democrat in West Memphis, but they're not. I assure you, they're not the typical Democrats that you would see in Washington D.C. They're much more akin to what you would expect out of a Republican crowd of candidates for the most part. Anyway, there were a lot of considerations, but partially Scott Ellington wanted to get the case out of his hair, and he thought this was a great way to do this. I don't think he realized the implications for this, which have followed him down for over 10 years, and he's known primarily as the weasel who let the West Memphis 3 go. Or even the West Memphis 3 supporters don't like Scott Ellington. He won no particular friends from his actions or his inaction. He really just didn't want to deal with the case. He admitted later he hadn't really looked at the case closely. It's unclear, but it seems that he did not know what the DNA results said when he agreed to this plea deal. And, he really just didn't care. He's an ambitious man. He's now a judge. And he's also weak, feckless, and an opportunist. He should do well in the political sphere. In fact, I think he's done pretty well. Anyway, Bob Ruff, decided he was going to do the same sort of harassing thing that was done back in 2000, not just 2011, but for several years before that, about the West Memphis 3, get supporters all riled up about it. And I think he succeeded to some extent in that what happened to Scott Ellington just shut down communication with Ruff. So Ruff gets to play a victim in this and gets on his podcast, claims correctly that Scott Ellington's not communicating with him. And actually the whole attitude became with the prosecuting attorney and West Memphis Police Department is their attitude seems to have been they just really don't want to deal with this. Haven't been particularly responsive to requests for information about the evidence. But at one point, Kent Cressman, who was the new prosecuting attorney for that district, apparently told Binka that he'd understood that maybe some evidence was missing, that there had been a fire at some point in the past, and the mayor, Marco McClendon, the mayor of West Memphis, also made a similar statement. Now, I've met Marco McClendon. I personally like the guy, but I wouldn't use him as a credible source on this kind of information. Just the fact that he's the mayor really doesn't make him a credible source. He's prone to shoot his mouth off without considering the consequences. So anyway, this went on for a while. Binka eventually filed for Freedom of Information. Under the Freedom of Information Act, he wanted to get some information from the West Memphis Police Department. The prosecuting attorney says, "Look, I don't have the evidence. I don't know what happened to the evidence. You really need to talk to the West Memphis Police Department." So Binka talks to the police department, and apparently they just simply don't pay a whole lot of attention to what Binka's got to say. They probably get phone calls, emails, etc., on a regular basis that probably are very annoying and take up a lot of work time and getting nowhere from supporters, some of whom make all sorts of wild claims that are totally unsubstantiated. So this went on for quite some time, and Binka filed against the West Memphis Police Department about the violation of the Freedom of Information Act. Now, the West Memphis 3 had 10 years to, if they wanted evidence retested, they could at least, I don't know who else is really even would have standing in this, but say they came to the courts and filed a motion for retesting of evidence, we could at least say, yeah, they made an attempt to have the evidence retested, but they've made no such attempt. And part of the conditions of their parole is that they wouldn't make such attempts. Part of the plea deal was that this case is essentially over with, other than the period of probation. We're not dealing with any further legal matters here. It's been resolved. But, it's come back. Eccles and his supporters, Mara Leverett, Lonnie Sowery, the rest of the hacks and the flacks, decided that this was a way to drum up anger among supporters. And, I suppose it succeeded to some degree. I noticed Eccles was, he had a fundraising campaign on GoFundMe, I think, and he was trying to raise a petition. It was a petition. He was trying to raise 5,000 signatures. It wasn't GoFundMe, it was a petition. He was trying to raise 5,000 signatures to support his efforts because he could use, if he got to the 5,000 mark, then he could flog that around the media as all the great support he had. I haven't looked in the last week or two, but the last time I looked, it was up. He had over 3,000, but he didn't have 5,000, and this petition had been out there for quite some time. And he had mentioned it. It wasn't just secret. I mean, he put it on. I know he tweeted about it at least once, perhaps more than once, and I assume that some of the usual supporters retweeted it. So, I don't know that the West Memphis Three have this widespread support that a lot of people seem to think they have. What they have are a lot of very vocal supporters, and very obnoxious supporters, by the way, and mostly very ignorant and downright stupid supporters, though there are some intelligent people who make a reasonable argument that such things as something I really don't disagree with is that the case with Jason Baldwin was very, very weak. Yeah, it was. I'm really surprised the jury convicted him on the basis of what was presented in court, but they did, and they had a legal basis for doing so. It wasn't as if they just arbitrarily convicted this guy for no reason whatsoever, but a lot of it hinged on a deathbed confession. And not a deathbed confession, a jailhouse confession that, you have to sort of take those with a grain of salt. And then there was some fiber evidence that seemed to link to Jason's house, but I wouldn't convict anybody on the basis of that fiber evidence ever, even though it is physical evidence. There is physical evidence in the case, but there's not much. So, anyway, the supporters, there aren't that many supporters who are even willing to go to the trouble just to sign a petition for Damien. Anyway, so we had this motion filed in Arkansas courts. It just sort of sat there for a bit, and then Binka I guess he was tired of, stuff in courts takes forever. If you've ever experienced that, unfortunately I've experienced it. I've actually watched how long it takes to resolve any number of criminal matters, and it takes forever. And I've been involved in various civil matters, and it just takes forever. He filed. He sent a notice off to West Memphis Police Department that they'd violated their the provisions for the Freedom of Information Act, and he wasn't getting a response. Now, the West Memphis Police Department, if they were found in violation of that, somebody, I guess, somewhere could face some penalties. But you'd really have to pin down who did what when, which would be very difficult. And basically what we're talking about, this whole thing with the so-called the quest for the missing evidence, really comes down to whether the West Memphis Police Department was going to furnish some sort of bureaucratic paperwork about the freedom of information, according to the Freedom of Information Act, to Patrick Binka so he could determine how the evidence had been handled over the years and if some was destroyed. It wasn't going to provide the evidence to him. It was not going to be retested. It was not going to take the case anywhere except for the one place that Mara Leverett and Damien Eccles and Lonnie Sowery wanted to take it, which was to try to embarrass and harass the West Memphis Police Department. I have to tell you, I think the police department should have just responded, said, we don't. If they don't have the record, just say we don't have them. Or if they do, say, get somebody, spend a morning or a whole day or how long it takes. Go ahead and just get it done and get it over there, get it off to them, and let's just get this over with. I don't think there's any significant evidence that's been destroyed, but I don't know. I really don't know the state of the evidence in the West Memphis 3 case. Now, we do know that some evidence didn't survive even to the point that, for instance, the paper bags in which a lot of the evidence was stored, in theory, might have had some residual DNA. Well, those paper bags were destroyed, but the defense knew that back in 2011, and they chose not to make a big deal out of it. It certainly didn't, they didn't do anything with it. And, there are provisions. It's a 10-year-old case. There are provisions that some certain classes of cases, they're supposed to preserve the evidence. And the West Memphis Police Department, perhaps they've made their best effort to do that, and perhaps not. I doubt seriously if they just consciously said, let's just destroy all the West Memphis 3 evidence because we're tired of hearing about it. And that would be up to the level of a criminal charge, probably for somebody, if somebody could actually be, that responsibility could actually be pinned to anybody. But it wouldn't be a major criminal charge. And it would not resolve anything in the case concerning the evidence, and it would not bring about retesting of the evidence. So, Mara Leverett and Lonnie Sowery, with Damien Eccles retweeting, and Jason Baldwin being surprisingly silent on all this, tweeted out that they were facing a 30-day deadline to come up with this information or an explanation of why what they don't have, and there was no court order. She repeated that error again and again, and never made any attempt to try to address it or straighten it out. The court records don't show. There might be. I haven't looked today. Maybe there's a court order that's popped up in the last 2 weeks, because I haven't checked it probably in 2 weeks. But there wasn't a court order when she was tweeting about it. And all it was a citation from Binka to the West Memphis Police Department, putting him on notice that they were in violation of the Freedom of Information Act, etc., etc. That's not a court order. It was filed with the courts. It's not even clear that it was ever served. Now, what's happened since is supposedly they've reached, after some months of an impasse, they've reached a point where there was some dialogue going on between Binka and the West Memphis Police Department, and supposedly the defense attorneys are going to get to see the evidence. It's not really, this is from Mara Leverett, so it's not particularly credible based on her past record with this, but apparently there's some sort of agreement between Binka and the West Memphis Police Department that he's going to get to get some sort of satisfaction about what's actually there as far as evidence is concerned. Is he actually going to get to physically examine it? He's certainly not going to be able to, hold it in his hands and all that. They're not going to let him do that. But is he actually going to get to see it, or is he just going to be presented some records about how the evidence was handled. It's not really clear, and some of the evidence in the case, case files are public record. You can go in there and check that. I understand they have some provisions there about you have to be an Arkansas resident or have an Arkansas resident vouch for you to be able to go in there and look at that evidence. I haven't tested it out since I moved out of the area, so I don't know that that's the case. I haven't heard that clarified at all, but it is public record. And certainly an Arkansas resident, Bink is an Arkansas resident, could go in there to the West Memphis Police Department and request to see the case files, and they would be required to present it to him. Back in 2013, Pam Hicks I think John Mark Byers was added on to this suit, but she was suing the West Memphis Police Department for access to the evidence. Some of this was somewhat understandable. She wanted to see these reminders of her son, his shirts and his jeans and so forth. And they had some court hearings, and her request was turned down, which tells you something about who gets to see this evidence. This is the mother of a murdered child in a case that has been resolved with people pleading guilty and people being convicted. But she and Mark Byers were not allowed to just go survey all this evidence. I don't know what's going to happen with Binka. Perhaps he has better standing than Pam Hicks did at the time. What that really happened at that hearing was they had a hearing. They got a lot of media out. I was there. You got a lot of media out, and they used that as a platform to set forth the Perp theory, which the court refused to hear, but this was a very similar sort of thing where it's all stuff that's played out in the media without any kind of real legal ramifications. They claimed that, they didn't claim, they showed some affidavits from two men who claimed they had information about the so-called Perp theory, which would involve Buddy Lucas, the now departed L.G. Hollingsworth Jr., David Jacoby, and Terry Hobbs partying down in the woods, and the boys, in some sort of gay drug fest, and the boys coming upon them, and the boys being killed because of this. Now, there's no evidence that happened. There's evidence that didn't happen. Jacoby was married at the time, and he was home that evening, except for when he was riding around with Terry Hobbs looking for... he wasn't home all evening, obviously. He was home, but, we know that Terry Hobbs was placed at a number... Jacoby was his primary alibi witness, but we know, for instance, he was seen by other parties that evening. Buddy Lucas, they were having some sort of family barbecue or something, and he'd gone over to Jessie Misskelley's house to offer him some chicken, and Jessie was gone, which is significant. And that's not strongly corroborated, but it is anecdotal. And then L.G. Hollingsworth, there's all sorts of crazy stuff about what L.G. Hollingsworth may have not been doing that night and the subsequent night. But we know he was seen at a laundromat later that evening, all spruced up for some bizarre reason. Who knows what was going on with that kid? The police talked to him over and over again and could never get his story straight, which made him very suspicious. And he was not really friends with Damien, but he was acquaintance. He was a frenemy, I guess. He was an acquaintance with Damien Echols, who seemed to have a thing for Dominique Tier, Damien's girlfriend, who supposedly was also his cousin, even though she really wasn't. Anyway, they supposedly did all this. Well, the two guys that were making this allegation were both, and this was not put out in the media. The story about the allegations were put out in the media, but the status of the two men was not put out in the media. They were, except I wrote it up, and maybe a few other people picked up on it, but for the most part, they did not look at who was making the allegations, and the allegations were being made by two convicted rapists who were both career criminals who were in the Arkansas prison at the time. I haven't checked very, very recently, but one got transferred over to Texas where he was facing some additional rape charges, and the other was, as far as I know, is still in Arkansas prisons on those same charges, and they were serving very, very long sentences, and they have multiple crimes in their records besides that. So, not the most credible witnesses, and with no other corroboration, and a lot of evidence suggesting that there was nothing to it at all. Anyway, that's the 2013 hearing. Anyway, and we haven't heard a whole lot about that since then. So Binka and the West Memphis Police Department apparently reached an agreement that he's going to be able to look at the evidence. Who knows what the result of that will be? Maybe this will all quietly resolve itself in that way. But I want to reiterate, the West Memphis 3 have never sought retesting for DNA of that evidence. Nothing that's happening here should result in the retesting of that evidence. You never know what a court's going to do, but I just don't. There doesn't seem to be any legal path to having that evidence retested. I'm not against the retesting of the evidence in theory, because frankly, I think there's a good chance we're going to come up with some DNA of the three killers. If they retest everything, and if the more selective you are about testing from the defense standpoint, if they decide not to retest the semen-stained jeans of Stevie Branch, that Jessie Misskelley described how Echols wiped himself off after ejaculating. If they decide not to test that, and I don't know if they can get good DNA results from that. Apparently genes it was hard to do at the time, and maybe this MVAC is much better. Maybe they could link that decisively to Damien Echols. Maybe not. Maybe it's somebody else, though I don't think it is. I have no reason to think it is. But the point being is if they don't test that, then it's just a question that'll always sit there. Whose semen stain was that? Because it almost certainly wasn't 8-year-old Stevie Branch's. So, who knows what the final result of this is going to be. But what has happened is that Marl Everett, Lonnie Sowery, Damien Echols, and Bob Ruff have all been able to make a big deal out of the whole thing. And it's a whole lot of smoke, but there's really no fire there. Anyway, I didn't know I was going to get into all that, but I'm glad I did. Thank you. I hope to resume podcasting a little more regularly. I'm not going to make any promises. I do have a lot of things. I'm not going to get into details about why. I've had some reasons for not podcasting, and I'm not going to get into all those reasons because, frankly, it's my personal business, and considering the crowd that may or may not listen to this, I just as soon not put my personal business out there. But anyway, I'm doing well, and I hope you're doing well, and I will talk to you again.